Hello friends! Ever wonder how digital brushes compare to their traditional counterparts? Well, it's time to find out. In this video, I'm teaming up with one of my talented artist friends to compare traditional versus digital gouache. Meet Dylan M. She's an illustrator, teacher, and sketchbook enthusiast. Her boldly colored and playful work has been featured on greeting cards, clothing, homewares, books, and more. But it's her sketchbook practice and sharing what she's learned with others that keeps her a happy artist. In case this is your first time watching one of my videos, I'm Gia Graham and I create digital art primarily in the Procreate app. I often incorporate lush flowers and foliage in my nature-inspired artwork. Dylan and I will both use the same photo as a reference, and we'll walk you through our process as we each create a gouache painting. Let's start with the supplies and setup.
Today I'm going to be painting with Holbein Artist Gouache in Ultramarine Deep, Primary Yellow, Flame Red, Primary Black, and Permanent White. I'm going to paint in my Etcher Hot Press Portrait Sketchbook using two paintbrushes from the Pigeon Letters. These are her studio round brushes in sizes 10 and 2. I'll be using a well-loved and stained plastic tray with wells for mixing paint, as well as a well-loved and stained paper towel. I've got some binder clips to hold my pages as I work, a glass of water, and a hairdryer to dry layers of paint as I go.
I'm working on an iPad Pro using the Procreate app version 5.4, and I have my canvas set to 4000 by 3000 pixels at 300 dpi. All the brushes I'll be using are default brushes from the Procreate library, and you can find them in the gouache set. The first is Baronia, which is great for loose, painterly marks. I might use Night Heron, which gives the effect of watered down paint, so it's pretty transparent. And I'm definitely going to use Gatsby because it's super smooth, creamy, and opaque. And finally, I'm going to use a Loyalty, which gives a really nice dry brush texture. I've shared full reviews for each of these brushes on my channel, and I'll include links in the description for each of those videos in case you want a full demo and more details on how each brush performs. For the palette, I pulled colors directly from the reference photo, so I'm working with three main colors, blue, green, and red, and I've got a range in values for each color.
I'm going to start with my vase. I'm squeezing out Ultramarine Deep and grabbing my size 2 brush. And I want to alter the vase in the reference to be kind of like a playful take on a Ming vase. So I'm getting my brush wet, but not too much because I'm going to be drawing with it. I'm starting with a loose and sort of imperfect shape. And I'm choking up here on my brush almost like a pencil to have more control as I start drawing in a dragon. It's okay that I'm pulling from my broken and dusty memory, just gives him character. I start painting leaves and little folk flowers around him. And I really love the texture of the gouache here, how it's dry in some places and more solid in others. And I just want to paint in his tiny wings to give them a little bit more emphasis.
This vase has a pretty distinct shape, so first I want to try to capture that as closely as possible, which is actually proving a bit more challenging than I expected. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and fill with a base layer of color, and then I might tweak the shape as I go along, because sometimes it's just easier to adjust a solid shape. I'm using this darker blue for the shadow areas, and it will also help me to further define the shape of the vase. I forgot to mention that I'm using the Loyalty brush here. You can really see that nice dry texture coming through. And it's opaque enough that you can layer light colors over darker colors. Even though I pulled colors from the reference photo, you can see that I'm not using those colors in the same way. I pulled these blues from the background of the photo, but I decided to switch it up and use them on the vase instead. And since I'm going rogue anyway, I'll push it even further and add a pattern to the vase, just to make it a little more interesting. Now you can see I've drawn the pattern over the highlights, but technically the highlight should make the pattern lighter as well. So I'm going to switch the brush to Night Heron and paint those highlights again, this time on top of the pattern. And since this brush is so transparent, the pattern will still show through. Okay, I think that works.
I'm ready to add some foliage in, so I'm squeezing out primary yellow and switching to my size 10 brush. I want looser paint, so I'm adding more water and I'm really kind of working at it with my brush. I'm going to add a touch of blue here to turn the yellow to yellow-green. And you can see how soupy this mix is compared to the blue. I start with some droopy greens below where my main flower will sit. The yellow is a more transparent color, so you can see the blue vase through these leaves, which I kind of like in contrast with more opaque layers. Now I want to lay out the stems for my other flowers. I think that is good structure, kind of set to kind of add in some leaves now. And I'm really pressing with my size 10 brush here to let it do the work. The reference photo has lots of cute little sprigs, and so I'm going to add in a few of those too. And then dry the paint with my hairdryer. Okay, I'm ready to start building up the flower bases. My flowers are going to be pink and red, so I'm adding flame red to my palette, which is a very powerful pigment. And my pink is going to be a mix of white, red, and just a touch of yellow to warm it up, so I'm adding white to my palette too. With the pink already on my brush, I'm starting to draw a simple rounded shape with a scalloped bottom. My paint is way too thick, so I'm adding some water to loosen it up. I'm making a similar but smaller flower shape here. And for my main flower, I'm going to use red, but it's okay if there's a little pink left on my brush, as it will help make the red just a little bit more opaque. I'm starting with a dot down for where I want the center of my flower to land, and then I draw a zigzaggy starburst shape around it. And my size 10 makes quick work of filling it in. The next layer of these flowers is going to be another scalloped shape, but in red. You may have noticed that these flowers aren't tied too tightly to the reference photo. As an illustrator, I really like to use the reference photo more as a skeleton and then kind of dress it up in my own way. Hence the playful dragon, Ming vase, and these folksy flowers. Okay, I am switching back to my pink to add a wonky starburst shape to the center of my bigger flower. I'm trying to lay the paint down in kind of single strokes so as to not disturb that vibrant red pigment below it. I'm going to let those dry and move on to the foliage details.
Now to tackle the foliage and flowers. This arrangement has these sparse and kind of wiry angular stems, so I'm trying to capture that general feeling, even though I'm not really trying to replicate exactly what I see. I've switched my brush to Baronia, by the way. It's a little more transparent than the first brush I used, and it's not quite as textured. I'm taking a pretty loose approach with the leaves, and this brush is perfect for that. Rather than painting precise leaf shapes, I can just kind of combine these short, wide strokes to make general leaf-like shapes. Now I'm using the Gatsby brush to put down the basic flower shapes. As I mentioned earlier, this brush is nice and creamy, so it's really pleasant to paint with. It's also pressure sensitive, so you can shift the stroke size and opacity slightly by adjusting how much pressure you're using. I think those subtleties help to make the paint strokes look a little bit more natural. As you can see, I'm not going for realism here. I'm leaning into some really fun, imaginative florals. I switched my brush back to Baronia, and I'm using a lighter green to add a few larger leaves to fill in some of the spaces. Now I can switch to a much darker green, and I'll add a few smaller leaves. Now this will make my arrangement much more full than the reference photo, but I think it needs that contrast in both scale and value to help balance things out.
I'm going to let those dry and move on to the foliage details. To add some contrast and details to my foliage, I'm going to mix up a darker green. And I start by adding more yellow to my palette, but this time instead of a dash of blue, I add like a whole blob of it. I think I'll just add some simple shapes to the twiggy guy over here. But for this other twig, I'm going to switch it up and add some kind of bigger and rounder leaves than the other one. I'm switching back to my size 2 brush to add some little flicks for details. And I know my hand is blocking a little, but you can see I'm just making little repetitive flicks with the brush. And I'm also moving right to left as I'm left-handed, and that just kind of helps not smear my hand through the paint. For the droopy guys, I just add some lines, and I really love that dry brush texture that comes out. Also go around and add some tiny dots. Now to add contrast to the darker leaves, I'll use my yellow-green, but it's really transparent, so I want to get some white mixed in to give it some staying power. That's kind of still low contrast. If I mix more white in, that's it. I really like it to pop like that. That's really why I really, love gouache. I get a little bit carried away and add some dots to finish off these leaves. I'm ready to finish off my flowers, and for these guys, I'm going to add a final layer of pink. And I'm trying to get that pink over the red without scrubbing so as not to disturb that red, which is exactly what happens with this little guy. That's fine. I'm going to let it dry, add a second coat, no problem. So while that dries, I'm going to add a yellow center to my big flower. With my size 2 brush, I pick up more red and add some simple details to both flowers. I can now go over this shape with another coat of paint, and once it dries, I can add his details.
All right, now for the details. I've gone back to the Gatsby brush to finish off these flowers. And as you can see, it's nice and opaque, so this light pink is giving good coverage without the darker red below showing through. This brush is also flexible enough that you can use it for really small details. And I'm taking advantage of the pressure sensitivity here. I'm just shifting how much I press down so my strokes taper off at the ends. Here I'm just adding a few little dots in the center. I'm just kind of pressing down with the pencil to make these organic, slightly textured marks. I think these petals need a little bit more contrast, so I'm going back in to add a darker red. Again, it's nice to have some contrast in scale, so I'm adding a few tiny little flowers to some of the stems. I'm going to keep the details on the leaves fairly simple. I'm just adding 1 or 2 lines to the center of each leaf. I'm still using the Gatsby brush, and I've got it set to a really small size. All right, I'm happy with that.
I'm loving how these flowers are looking. Now, I just want to make them kind of pop with a bold black background, so I add some black to my palette. I pick up some leftover paint to shift the black to have a little bit more colorful depth. It's pretty subtle, but it is a shift that I like. I'm mixing in a good bit of water to loosen up my paint so I can really move it around the page. And I'm going to start by outlining an oval shape around the bouquet and the border of the page. I love the dry brush texture at the edge, and I'm going to try and preserve that as I color in, which I do while keeping a halo of space between the background and flowers. And once again, painting from right to left so that my hand doesn't smear through the paint. And she's all done.
The last thing I want to do is add a little color in the background, just to frame the illustration. Let's see, since my vase is so dark, I think I'll use a really light color, and any of these brushes will work. I'm just going to use Veronia. Of course, the beauty of working digitally is that I can paint a solid color in the background at any point in the process. If I were using traditional paint, I would have needed to plan ahead and put this block of color down first, but working in layers allows me to easily make last-minute decisions like this. All right, I'm all done. Let's take a look at both paintings side by side. Obviously, Dylan and I used the reference photo as a really loose guide. We both took lots of creative liberties and interpreted the image in our own individual styles. With Dylan's painting, you can really see all the beautiful qualities of traditional gouache. The colors are rich and vibrant, there's a mix of both creamy and dry textures, and depending on the colors and how the paint is mixed, it can be very opaque or slightly transparent. Of course, with traditional paint, you do have to be mindful of drying times to avoid smudging, but gouache is pretty forgiving. I think Procreate's brushes do a pretty good job of replicating some of the qualities of traditional gouache. You can get a range of textures from creamy to dry, as well as a nice range in opacity, depending on which brush you're using. Of course, there's no drying time to worry about, and like I mentioned in my demo, you do have lots of flexibility when you work in layers. The one thing that's missing in the digital version is that tactile quality. With traditional gouache, those layers of built-up paint have physical depth to them, which of course is challenging to replicate digitally. As usual, they both have their pros and cons, and it's really just a matter of preference. Thanks for painting with me, Dylan. If you'd like to see more of Dylan's work, you can check out her Patreon community, watch her online courses, or find her on YouTube. I'll leave links in the description for where to find her. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love if you'd give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.